Welcome back to my channel, guys. Yes, I'm finally cleaning up my act and I figured out a more convenient setup with good lighting. This is good lighting, right? Anyway, guys, I know a lot of you don't like when I create videos like this one about pop culture stuff or current events. But I need to get this off my chest. And I'm sure that some of you out there want to have this conversation with somebody. So I watched the Laci Peterson documentary on Netflix that came out days ago. If you're not familiar with the Laci Peterson case, early 2000s, 8 months pregnant woman goes missing on Christmas Day. Huge, manhunt search commences. This is in California. There's more and more panic, of course, with her family. And then suspicion starts to be pretty early on, be oriented towards her husband, who is bizarrely aloof, doesn't seem too enthralled with looking for her, right? All the typical red flags of like, check out the husband, like what's happening with the husband. Spoiler alert, he's now in jail for life because he was found guilty. Even though there's no real obvious evidence, it's not like her blood was on his hands or anything like that, but it's like all signs point to him. And if you know enough about these kinds of stories, more so than not, it's the husband or the ex, or the guy, the creep in the neighborhood. Like it's often somebody with kidnappings, with murder, it's often somebody who knew the person, heavily involved, and so on. Now this story is 20 years old, so it's not like this is a new thing. I feel like I knew most of the pieces of the puzzle from this story. I remember it being such a big deal all over the news. In fact, I was thinking about it after watching, and I thought this might have been the biggest murder story scandal that I saw growing up in terms of the ubiquity of it being on Nancy Grace, on CNN, on this channel, on that channel. I know for a lot of people that's the O.J. Simpson case, that they remember that being everywhere. But I didn't live in the US yet, and I was like, I think 5 years old when the O.J. Simpson case happened. I don't know that it got the same attention internationally. I'm sure it still got attention, but not quite the same level of coverage that it received on a national level. So for me, the Scott/Laci Peterson case, I remember this being probably the biggest case of my childhood in terms of coverage. But I would say the Jodi Arias case also got a ton of coverage. And I think why this happens, and this is part of the point of this video, is people are riveted by cases about especially attractive white women, either being the victim or being the villain. And so I'm watching this documentary on Laci Peterson, and then I went down a rabbit hole. And I discovered that this is actually a theme. It's called family annihilation, when oftentimes a man will decide to just kill the girlfriend or the wife, including potentially the children, if there are children, or unborn children, for the sake of moving on, clean slate, instead of what, most of us would do, which is ending the relationship and then moving on to the affair or the mistress or just a new life. Obviously, this showcases quite a bit about the nature of a psychopath, a narcissistic psychopath, that they would rather preserve their image as a family man than actually go through the process of being seen by the community, the family, as now the divorced man who was the one who initiated the divorce, right? I mean, it's mind-boggling to think that somebody would prefer to end another person's life. I mean, that really goes to show you like lack of empathy, right? Because you're not just ending the person's life, you're now doing something that's going to permanently affect the lives of everybody in your family, in that person's family. So it's pretty fascinating from a psychological analysis. But what's even more fascinating is that this is even a theme. And in the documentary, the thing that stood out to me the most in the documentary was that the number one cause of death in pregnant women is homicide, it's murder. The number one cause of death. So as I said, I went down a rabbit hole and then discovered how similar the Chris Watts story was. If you remember that case, also a huge profiled case, similar idea. He killed his wife, unborn child, as well as the kids. Same idea, he wanted to start over. He figured that was the easier way out, presumably. Tried to cover up his tracks, he failed miserably. And then you know how this goes with Netflix, right? You watch one thing and then it recommends another thing. So last night I was watching the Texas Killing Field murders. There's this region in Texas, near Houston, Texas, where in the 70s, 80s, and even the 90s, this was an area notorious for bodies getting discovered because it was like middle of nowhere, dumpster kind of area. Like nobody's checking, people are just tossing stuff, including bodies. And there was this theme throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s of women's bodies getting discovered, particularly very young women, like teenage, 20-something and so on. Here's the thing, right? Psychopaths are always going to exist. Although I will say one of the takeaways for me was how I feel like we don't hear about serial killers anymore. So that's very interesting to me that these documentaries often profile serial killers of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. But I don't feel like we hear about that anymore. And I don't know if that's because DNA technology now, like forensic technology is so advanced that it's more preventative than ever of somebody becoming a serial killer. Like maybe we catch them early enough to not be serial killers. Is it that the technology scares people away from committing so many crimes? That one I doubt, because I feel like a psychopath is always going to exist. And as long as murder is a thing, I don't know that people are actually afraid of consequences. One of the defining factors of a psychopath is a lack of understanding of long-term consequences. It's almost like a little kid who's just a troublemaker and can't think about the potential ramifications down the road. So I don't think that people are actually afraid of the current laws and current technology enough to not commit crimes. So I've always wondered that. If you actually have any context on this, I want to know, why do we not hear about serial killers currently? Or is it that in the 80s and the 70s, there was a whole generation of men so traumatized by whether it was childhood trauma or like, I feel like oftentimes it's war veterans. Like, I feel like several serial killers went to Vietnam. So is that part of it, like a mental health thing that perhaps today we have better resources for, even though there is definitely still a mental health problem, at least in the US? Anyway, that's a side story, but that was one of my takeaways. My other takeaway was, wow, all of these stories about women being disposed, not just objectified, but being treated as like trash to throw out into the bay, out into the ocean, out into oil tanks, out into oil fields. There's a theme here. Obviously, this happens to men as well. It's not like exclusively women are victims, but it seems like there's a disproportionate number of women who will meet this fate. And again, that statistic about pregnant women, for me, was like, whoa, like my jaw dropped hearing that out loud, that a pregnant woman, the number one cause of death of pregnant women is murder. I don't want to make this like a feminist rant video. To be honest, I'm one of those people, I'm very cynical and skeptical, and I'm the first person in 2024 in this modern era to be critical of people who go straight to that mindset. Like, I get really annoyed by women who will say that whole thing about how, like, in the workplace, if a man has an attitude, if a man is condescending and rude and knows what he wants, like, people praise him, but if it's a woman, they consider her a bitch. I hate when people say that. I think it's bullshit. I think if you're a jerk, people are gonna think you're a jerk, no matter what. Some people will always support shitty behavior, but I don't think that's related to gender. I think some people just look at that and they see that as power. Not to get political, but Donald Trump is a great example of this, right? There are people who are riveted by him, who love everything he says, everything he does, because they see him as a boss. But it's clear that a huge portion of the population sees right through that and knows that it's a charade and is turned off by that kind of like vitriol and that kind of rhetoric. My point is that I'm very quick to poke holes in any conversation nowadays related to inequality, because I feel like oftentimes people will just look for things that seem aligned with their belief system without examining things that directly oppose their belief system. But watching these documentaries, it really hit me like, wow, there must be a very profound problem with not just misogyny, but like the loathing of women for these crime stories to have consistent themes. Of course, there's exceptions, right? There's female murderers, there's women who, in the heat of, the moment, what are they called? Passion crimes, like they'll strangle the husband, they'll stab the husband, whatever. Of course, there's the Jeffrey Dahmer types, right, who only go after young men. But these are all exceptions. There's so many stories. Well, I referenced O.J. Simpson before. O.J. Simpson, another great example. This idea of, if I can't have you, then nobody can have you. I'm going to control you, control the end of your life. After a while, it begs the question, where does this come from? Where does this primitive instinct or desire to control women, to hurt women, to abuse women, and to see them as like disposable, where does that come from? One final note that I found very interesting about the Laci Peterson story, that you also see in several other stories like this, the Chris Watts story, also Casey Anthony, if you remember. Casey Anthony, female, killed her kid, same idea, just wanted to start a new life, didn't want to have a kid anymore suddenly. There's often this theme of the family members being enablers, like the family is standing by them without a shadow of a doubt. Scott Peterson, his sister and sister-in-law are still 20 years later fighting for his freedom. One of them, his sister-in-law, became a lawyer to defend him. So not only are they convinced he's innocent, but they're still devoting all this energy to make him a free man, even though to any critical thinker watching this from the outside, it seems kind of obvious that there was foul play involving him. So going back to this human psychology thing with psychopaths, it makes you wonder how much of this is like they have this disposition for lack of empathy, but then their environment growing up, coming from families that maybe never gave them consequences for bad behavior, always excuse them from consequences. Is this the perfect formula for these kinds of cases, for these kinds of stories? I want to know what you think. Let me know in the comments. What are your thoughts? Do you watch documentaries like this? Did you catch the Laci Peterson documentary on Netflix? Let's talk about it in the comments.